All right, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the masterclass with Professor Matt Sanders, exploring flexibility and fidelity and program delivery in parenting. People are still arriving a little bit now, so we're going to get started in a couple of minutes. If you haven't already, there's plenty of tea, coffee, and there's heaps of danishes and cakes and all sorts at the back there. Help yourselves, or even during Matt's presentation, if you grab something. Matt's going to be speaking for a couple of hours, so we're not going to have a break in between or anything like that, so feel free to top yourselves up before we get started. My name's Craig Stewart. I'm the Director for Early Years and Parenting here at the Department of Communities, and I've got the pleasure of being the MC for this afternoon, which will take all the 5 minutes, because it's a very easy, simple job I've got, because Matt's going to be doing all the talking. A couple of things on housekeeping. If you haven't found them already, the toilets and stuff, literally that corridor you've just came in through the back there, if you go to the left, there's toilets there near the lifts, and there's toilets right near the entrance there as well. There isn't any fire alarm drills planned, so if the alarms do go, you'll hear the usual whoop whoop and scream and sirens and things like that. There are stairs exactly there, and you can see the little green figure there points to it. The muster point, for some of you, it would be a great pleasure to go at the muster point right outside Myers. So if the alarm goes, if you're not willing it to happen, you can go some shopping whilst you're there as well. So that's probably as complicated as it gets this afternoon. Now, you might look around and you can see we've got, for those of you who have been here before, we don't normally have all these big lights set up and a big thing in the corner there. We have the session being live streamed this afternoon. So it'll be a live presentation. It is being recorded as well, and I believe the recording will be made available on YouTube going forward. What we will do, once the session's finished, through our MailChimp bulletin as well, we'll send you out links to the YouTube clips, and as we know where that actually is located, so you can follow up at your leisure later on. Just before I go on and introduce Matt, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, whose land we're meeting on this afternoon, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge Carol Markey-Dadds from Brisbane Triple P International, who sat down there in the corner came over with Matt, and Lisa Studman from WA from Triple P International. So Lisa's our local contact here as well. And I'd also like to welcome and thank members of the Triple P Joint Management Group. For those of you who don't know, the Joint Management Group is literally that, a joint management group, but comprises representatives from health, so Catch and Wax, Department of Education, and Department of Communities. And that group helps coordinate Triple P here in Western Australia. And they've been instrumental in sort of facilitating today's session and inviting Matt over to do this session this afternoon. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Matt Sanders. So Professor Sanders is a Professor of Clinical Psychology and a Director of the University of Queensland's Parenting and Family Support Centre. He's also the founder, as a lot of you will be aware of, Triple P, the Positive Parenting Programme. And Professor Sanders is considered a world leader in the development, implementation, evaluation, and dissemination of population approaches to parenting and family interventions. And it's with great pleasure I'll throw over to Professor Sanders and sit back and enjoy the session. Thank you.
Right. I know, I shouldn't have touched anything. I just need to go back to my starting slide here. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honoured to be here today to, I think, stimulate your thinking about how we tackle the task of delivering programs with both fidelity and flexibility. This is a pretty major challenge for anyone who's been involved in the development of an evidence-based parenting intervention, because a lot of time and thought goes into planning how these programs should look and how they could be most effectively deployed when they're being implemented in the community. But it's virtually impossible to envision all the varying contexts within which a parenting intervention might need to be used, might be deployed. So we're going to begin this discussion by looking at evidence-based parenting support and some of the reasons behind why the development of protocols and manuals and so on are so essential for the initial testing of an evidence-based practice, and then move to considering what it is that we need to do to promote the appropriate implementation of these interventions, but with sufficient flexibility that they're responsive to the needs of families that we're actually working with. And then finally, I'm going to move to consideration of some examples of tailoring of general principles and strategies, but to special contexts that are where there's a considerable need for such interventions to be available. Okay, so you can't see anything on the screen here, is that correct? Oh, right, here we go. So the question is, how can parenting interventions be used to deliver the best outcomes for children? So when you think about the current state of thinking on a sort of a global scale, it's pretty well recognised that parenting is considered an extremely important determinant of children's well-being, right in the here and now and in the future. It's also pretty clear that the way in which we raise our kids actually has longer life-term or life course impacts in terms of functioning in adulthood, both in the domain of mental health and physical health of adults. There's a global emphasis on increasing access to evidence-based parenting support programs. So you'll see in the UK, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence in Social Care, the CDC in the US, particularly their violence and injury prevention branches, and then the World Health Organization, UNOCD, which is the Office of Drugs and Crime, UNICEF. These kind of world organizations have all pretty much recognized that the vast majority of the world population don't access high-quality evidence-based parenting programs, and that there's a big push to make these programs more widely available. Going along with this has been the rising influence of what are referred to as evidence-based lists, which are essentially guiding commissioning of services and government priorities they put into what sort of programs and services should be funded. And so in different countries, so for example in the United States you've got this list called Blueprints for Healthy Development. They've also got in California, the California Clearinghouse of Evidence-Based Social Work. These are all lists that are maintained independent of developers that focus upon establishing certain standards of scientific proof that are necessary for a program to be considered an evidence-based program. And of course, there's not just one standard of evidence, there's often different levels of evidence that are created for these programs. But they're increasing their influence in the sense that the commissioning of services, parenting services in many jurisdictions are being restricted to whether or not you're on the list or not. So this becomes a very important issue in terms of what kind of programs going into the future are likely to be funded. Now, as a developer of a parenting intervention, you're always thinking about, look, when are you likely to achieve the best outcomes? And most people who've developed evidence-based, not just parenting programs, but school-based interventions and a variety of child-focused prevention and treatment programs would argue that the best outcomes are going to occur when they're delivered properly. And when you're talking about being delivered properly, it's being really referring to the interventions that are being delivered with high fidelity, Now, if we go on to, in a little while, talking about what this actually means in practice, then we can start thinking about the implications of this for our everyday work. Now, one thing I'd like to say right at the outset is that we think of evidence-based generally as a scientific, perhaps a professional and a policy issue, but it is actually also a consumer issue. There's been a number of surveys that have been done of the parenting population that have asked parents, what are the things that would influence your decision to participate in a parenting program? And generally either number 1 or 2 on the list is that the program has been proven to be effective. Now, parents may not know what proven means in a sort of scientific sense, but as a consumer, it doesn't matter what we buy these days, whether it's a car or we're buying a TV or we're buying something else for our home. Most consumers are highly attuned. Is this the best? And is it good value for money? And oftentimes when we think about parents being able to make a judgment about whether or not to participate in a parenting program, we make that judgment a very difficult one for them because they don't even know what they're investing in terms of what a program looks like, what the look and feel of it is. I mean, who would move into a house without going into it and checking out the rooms, or buy a car without driving it? But sometimes we expect parents to participate in programs that have actually got very little knowledge about what the commitment is and what's actually involved. So when we start to think about manualised interventions, in theory, these are processes that program developers go through to provide as clear a guidance as possible about the following kind of things. For example, the theoretical basis of the program and its evidence base. Manuals attempt to clarify the goals, session structure within session activities, the procedures used to assess outcomes with participating families, and usually make a call on for whom this intervention is appropriate or effective for. Manuals will often provide verbatim examples of how you might introduce an activity, what you might say in explaining something. And they're generally thought of as aids to facilitate practitioners learning a new intervention. Of course, they're best combined when they're used in the context of competency-based training and, I might say, supervision. So you think about a manualised intervention is something that when you look at it as an isolated resource, you're not looking at it in context. And the proper context is one in which you're thinking about the complete system of acquiring a body of knowledge and expertise about how to most effectively deploy the intervention. There is no evidence to support a conclusion that says that if you use manualised interventions, you're somehow damaging the therapeutic relationship or good therapeutic relationships can't develop. On the contrary, most evidence-based parenting programs that are delivered well, really good relationships develop between practitioners and the participating parents who are involved. Whatever guidance is provided in a manual about introducing activities, it's not a script. It's not like verbatims where you're learning lines, where there's an example used in a manual that might illustrate something you might say is not a must say that. So people have to flexibly adapt it to their own words and ways of relating to the audience that they have that are participating in the program. And it always requires a skilled and knowledgeable practitioner. So no manual is ever a substitute for professional knowledge. Now you go back 30, 40 years in the world of parenting intervention where there were no manuals at all, and that was the beginning of my work in parenting. I think the only manual that I ever laid my eyes on was Jerry Patterson's very first thing in 1975 he published on family intervention, and I thought it was the most incredible thing I'd actually ever seen because it demystified what you would actually do in working with parents, or how you might say. Prior to that it had been book chapters and things that were not very specific, and you had no idea of actually how to do it. you actually had to see it or sit in a practical kind of way with someone who'd sort of learned how to do it. Now we've got to the stage where there are so many manuals for so many things, it's almost as though the underlying theory that informs how you best do something and how you flexibly apply the knowledge has been replaced. And that's a reflection of a poor manual, not a problem with manuals. It's the way in which this knowledge needs to be shared in a way that maintains a practitioner's capacity to think flexibly and to apply what they know in working with the families they're working with. Now, the other thing is that manuals, of course, become less important the more knowledge and skill you've got. But it's interesting, if you haven't delivered a program for a while and you're going back to it for the first time, gee, that manual's handy to have there, to just go back and refresh about what to deliver and the structure and that kind of thing. So it's good as a refresher and also as a way of checking yourself or benchmarking against whether or not what you're delivering is likely to be meeting optimal standards of appropriate delivery. Now, behind this kind of concern about using manualised interventions are a number of kind of things that you hear people say. Look, manuals make it too prescriptive and it limits the capacity of a practitioner to be innovative. Well, I really don't agree with that. There has been some incredible innovations that we've seen with practitioners delivering evidence-based practices in terms of not only examples but how they deliver it, where they deliver it, who they deliver it to, and we'll come on to a few of those in a moment. The idea, however, is that rigid adherence interferes with the development of that relationship, which I previously wanted to challenge. However, what I would say is that rigidity in delivery is a problem because it means that you're not attuned to the learner and the group of people that you're actually working with. And so that capacity to think on your feet, vary the example, vary the emphasis, to vary how long you spend on something is not properly taken into account. The use of a set curriculum makes it harder to individualise to clients' needs. Well, that's only the case if there are no activities built into the delivery of the program that enable individualisation. And what you will see when we come on to the design of a system of intervention, how there's tremendous capacity for individualisation once you adopt a self-regulatory framework in working with parents. Because a self-regulatory framework is going to mean that the parents' own goals and their own aspirations are the thing that is driving what it is that you need to create in terms of a learning environment for the parent to acquire the skills and knowledge they're seeking. Okay, the other thing that's often said is that that's fine, but manualised programs don't work at all well with complex cases, with chaotic families. You can't get any structure, you can't get any sequencing or timing. It's just sort of a world of uncertainty and chaos. Well, that's also a problem for any form of therapy, any form of intervention with those families. And things that actually create a bit of certainty and predictability and some boundaries around the things that you're doing actually make it much easier for chaotic people to learn. But if you're feeding into a world of uncertainty and chaos by having sessions that are totally all over the place and disorganised and you can't get through any sequenced activities and so on, it's much harder for everyone. The other thought that comes through is that manualised interventions are fine, but no one uses them anyway after initial training. So what's the point? What's the point? Well, the point is that these are a learning resource that you go back to at various points in time to the minimally sufficient degree you require to get on with it, to do what you need to do in a competent way. So when we talk now about strategies that promote fidelity and flexibility, let's have a look at how we're going to unpick this. So the first point that I'd make is that achieving these dual aspirations, flexibility and fidelity, we can consider this at three different levels. First of all, can we design a system of parenting support that inherently has built into the design the capacity for flexible delivery. That's the first thing. Secondly, how can we ensure the program content is delivered appropriately to make it responsive to the needs of families we're working with? And then finally, how can we ensure programs are delivered with both fidelity and flexibility to make sure that we're getting the best outcomes for kids? So when we talk about flexibility and fidelity, all evidence-based programs that are manualised needed for any kind of testing or trialling in a randomised trial to be able to describe the protocol. The protocol needed to be deliverable by multiple different therapists who might have been involved in the trial, but essentially it had to be reproducible. So there was something that was related to the science of the evaluation of an intervention that required a level of clarity and specificity so that you could actually train people to do it and then be able to scale those learnings to a broader workforce beyond the trial. So in a lot of ways, the rise of evidence-based practice and randomised trials, an incidental byproduct of having done so was to produce manuals. It used to be called the integrity of the independent variable. You needed to be able to specify with clarity what the set of procedures were that were deployed. Now, and of course, developers along the way were arguing that these programs are going to work best when they're delivered as intended, that is with fidelity. And it doesn't mean inflexible, non-responsive delivery. In fact, you'd say it the other way. It actually has to be flexible, responsive delivery for it to be considered a decent program, a program being delivered with fidelity. The other thing that I'd just like to remind everyone of is that it doesn't matter how well specified a program is, it always comes with a brain, and that's your brain as a practitioner. And so you're always thinking, hypothesis generating, hypothesis testing individuals who are trying to respond the best you can to the context that you find yourself in with the delivery of the program. Fidelity refers to the extent to which a practitioner adheres to a program's content and process in a manner that's consistent with the theory, program logic, and the manual or protocol. Practitioners need sufficient knowledge and skill for them to apply and appropriately adapt an intervention to work with families they work with. The thing is that you don't know how to flexibly adapt until you know the program. So you actually have to learn what the program is before you know what to vary or what you can vary. And sometimes people never get to the point of learning the program properly because they're already adapting it before they've started. Whereas if you've got the experience of trying to learn how to do it properly, then you have much better adaptations of it in response to need. And so in some ways what you see is a tension between adherence to a program and flexibility is an issue of practitioners being able to generalise and flexibly transfer their knowledge and learning to diverse contexts. A problem of generalisation, a lack of generalisation. So people become so kind of narrowly focused on having to adhere to something in a very prescriptive way, they are restricting the learnings that they would otherwise derive that would lead to a much greater psychological flexibility that they would have as a clinician. Now, flexibility of program delivery refers to appropriate and permissible variations, adaptations or customisation of a program content and process of delivery as described by the developers of a program. And flexible delivery is essential to achieve the best outcomes. Look, the other thing I just want to make sure that we just keep in mind is that it doesn't matter how good an evidence-based practice is and how much research is being conducted of it. For a program such as our program, Triple P, there are now 305 evaluation studies conducted on this, 155 randomised trials. It's the most extensively studied and evaluated parenting intervention anywhere in the world. But it doesn't mean it's going to work in your hands. it doesn't mean that your individual deployment of it is going to be successful. And therefore, in order to make sure whatever adaptations and changes you do, it's always in a context of evaluating the outcomes to ensure that it's producing the results you think an adaptation should achieve. Because you can adapt something and it still not work. And you can change lots of things about it and it still won't work. In fact, you can do the program as prescribed and it doesn't work because there's always non-responders to any intervention. So one of the messages that I would carry forward is that the promotion of reflective practice, the promotion of the ability to track and monitor outcomes with families is essential in promoting both fidelity of an intervention and its flexible application. So when you think of the goal of of delivering programs in a need-responsive manner, and although this slide conveys it's a flexibility versus fidelity, it's actually and fidelity. And so when you think about a program and you think about the content and you think about the process, the way in which you delivered it, we can think about variations and adaptations that are low risk. In fact, you almost have to do them in order for it to be effective. And then you can think about adaptations that are high risk. And I'm going to go through what high and low risk adaptation actually looks like, and that so you have a good understanding of that. Now, there is something about the design of parenting support that is informed by evidence that is fundamental to a community's capacity to flexibly deploy different evidence-based practices. And this is about the design of a system of parenting support. Now, I'll move on to that. The argument that we've put in many contexts, including the most recent anniversary edition of Family Matters, is that parenting support is a whole of population issue. And that if we just think about who our current client population is, doesn't matter what context you're working, whether it's in schools, whether it's in early childhood sectors, whether it's in the mental health system, whether it's in community child health, where it is, you're always sampling a narrow range of the total population of people out there who may be experiencing difficulties with parents in their parenting role. Now, the reason the adoption of a population perspective is so important from a flexibility perspective, it means that we have variations in the levels of need that families have for accessing parenting support. And if we think about parenting and good parenting essentially as the clean water of child mental health accomplishment and well-being, it puts the importance of parenting in the proper perspective. Because as we're going to be arguing more fully, a change in parenting is a common pathway to achieving many diverse outcomes with children. Now, if you think about the aspirations that may stem, you actually need to see this slide to get the context for it. But essentially, imagine a slide. Oh, here we are. I was just going to create a mental picture for you. But if you think about the parent-child relationship and parenting practices in the day-to-day, moment-to-moment interactions of parents and children, and the different range of impacts that the parent-child relationship has to early brain development, to language and communication, literacy, executive function and self-regulatory capacities of kids, which we know are so related to both learning outcomes and long-term health and well-being of individuals, how well they're doing at school, the extent to which conduct problems and antisocial behaviour develops. I won't read through the whole list other than to just draw to your attention that if you think about the diverse range of aspirations we have for children to be healthy, to be achieving, to develop mentally healthy approaches to living, parenting is related to many of these diverse outcomes. So it's not just about emotional well-being, it's not just about social skills, it's about health, and it's about kids' moral development, a very wide range of behaviour that has to do with their interactions with technology and so on. Now, what that means is that we can have a parenting offer that is delivered in a particular way, but the flexibility stems from the capacity to apply these principles and strategies to diverse outcomes. And those diverse outcomes are sometimes driven by what parents' priorities are, and they should always be. And so when you think about what parents who might attend a positive parenting seminar will take from it, the starting point of what they take depends on what their current issues are that they're experiencing with their kids. So when you think about designing a system of parenting support that has the greatest flexibility and capacity to be responsive to differences in need, well, what does this need to look like? Well, first of all, it needs to be multi-level, not a one-size-fits-all. It needs to be multidisciplinary because no discipline has a mandate to provide parenting support to all families, and there are many different contexts within which different professionals will come into the lives of families and parents will seek guidance and support from them. The approach needs to be inclusive, so it's not just deliverable to the kind of educated middle-class families, but the full diversity of families, including parents of kids with special needs, Indigenous families, refugee families, the list goes on and on. The interventions need to be culturally appropriate, and we need to be able to ask ourselves, well, what does that look like? Depending on whether you're living in a city or a rural or isolated area. What does cultural relevance and appropriateness actually refer to when it comes to the establishment of parenting goals and the ways in which parents will choose parenting strategies that they wish to employ with their kids? We need an intervention that is actually effective, that will be proven, ideally, to be associated with clear, definable outcomes with particular families who've participated. And if we adopt a population perspective, we go well beyond thinking about caseness in terms of our kids improving from pre to post and maybe maintaining their improvement over time. We start to think about how do we track the well-being of children and families at a population level? What kind of administrative data can we use to ensure that individual differences in levels of need in terms of whether people are living in low socioeconomic catchment areas of a city or a geographical area, whether they're responding in same or different ways to the offer of a parenting intervention. And that's why in the development of the multi-level system of the positive parenting program, we began at a level 4, which was kids with pretty much serious conduct problems. It was kids who were aggressive and non-compliant. We'd call them now kids with ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. But it was pretty much recognised that right from the get-go in the early 80s, that this method of coaching, home visitation, coaching, feedback, watching feedback, practice feedback, until parents were able to deploy the intervention, was going to be difficult to scale. It would be expensive. And it could be that kids with the same level of need could respond to a different delivery modality that was more efficient, that was cheaper, that got to a wider range of people. So over a 4-decade period now, we've tried to build this evidence-based system of parenting support that inherently in the design has flexibility in terms of not only being able to access the program in different delivery modalities, group, individual, online, over the phone, but also at different dosages in terms of levels of intensity. So we had a beautifully delivered, no doubt, parenting seminar this morning on the power of positive parenting. A lot of those fundamental principles that parents get bite-sized little pieces of and an introduction to can be delivered over a longer time period with more examples, more exercises, more activities, more practice, so that they can consolidate that learning with further instruction to the minimally sufficient degree they require in order to acquire the skills and to be able to implement it effectively. So the point about design of a system means that when you have different delivery formats, like I've just described, the reason we have this flexibility in systems design has been informed by two things: geography. Some families live in rural and isolated areas, and attending a once-a-week parenting class when it's 100 kilometres to the nearest town is difficult. It's not practical for many people. And prior to the internet, we did Triple P over the phone. Triple P over the phone still works, but it can be now delivered as a Skype over the phone, or now we've got the online version of the program. It enables people to access it 24/7. Now, the thing about the design of a system that provides flexible ways for parents to engage doesn't mean in your local area you have all these options accessible to you. It will be influenced by the workforce that's available, who's been trained in different levels of intervention and so on. But if you look at the design of a system overall, what you're seeking to do is create equal opportunities for people to participate, regardless of where they are, what kind of kids they have, and their unique parenting circumstances. A good, well-designed, evidence-based system of parenting support is not only multi-level with flexible delivery, but it will evolve variants that would enable parents at different phases of the life cycle, from babies to teenagers, to access the programs. And we've developed a number of different variations of our program, like Stepping Stones, which is done with a lot of work in Western Australia to establish this program for parents of kids with special needs. Lifestyle Triple P for parents of kids who are overweight and obese. Family Transitions for kids who've been through separation, divorce. See, what you see here are just examples where a different variant was needed to ensure that differences in context and circumstances of families are taken into account. Now that means that's a very expensive way of doing flexible adaptation, because it involves a whole new program being developed, a new training resource, new manuals, new workbooks, and so on. And at one level you can say, well, maybe this is not necessary. Maybe having all of these different variants was not only not necessary but not appropriate. Maybe if the practitioners had just been more flexible in the first place, they would have taken the core knowledge and applied it to the families in a different context. Now, the other thing I'd like to show you is this notion of whatever the current assessed level of need of a parent is, never assume that that's static. Never assume that the parent is not evolving and changing over time. So if you think about a model of intervention where you've got different variants for kids, different ages, you've got different delivery modalities, and you've got different levels of intensity, and you've got different contexts wherein families are participating. For example, the parent might have a child, might themselves have a mental illness or a substance abuse problem, or some other kind of thing that makes their lived circumstances in raising children a little different. And then you'll have differences in severity of the child's problem and the parent's problem. So in designing a unique offer for that family, you can think about choosing various ways in which you might want to deliver it at a given point in time. Now, if you track this out longitudinally, and this is for a typically developing child who's healthy, normal, in the normal range of development, one of the things about the design of a system that creates flexibility is the capacity to engage and disengage and re-engage. So it's just as important that the exiting of a program as its entry, because a soft entry and an easy exit with soft re-entry enables the parent to see the journey of learning to parent as not an inoculation approach, not a one-shot, you're going to you be inoculated and do it as a baby or when your kids are a baby, and that's going to stand you for the rest of your life. Well, we know that it's simply not true. You can have periods in our lives as parents where the parenting challenges are created not just because we're in a new developmental stage with our kids, but our life circumstances has changed. We've been relocated to a new town. We've lost our job. We've got a partner who's ended up in jail. We've developed a chronic health problem. We've had a death in the family. We've had a suicide. Now, the thing that I'll just say is that the emphasis on the early years, the first 1,000 days of life, as though this is the magic bullet. I absolutely do not believe this. The first 1,000 days of life are extremely important, but so is the rest of your life. And good parenting and poor parenting can influence us from in every stage of our development. And you can have a person who's functioning well in the presence of natural disaster, tragedy, murder, some circumstance that changes context, and you've got a new set of problems for which parenting support may be required. If we remind ourselves that the role of a parent is a lifelong commitment to our offspring, and we just remind parents that not to form a conclusion too soon about how well they're doing in the parenting role. Let's wait and see how our kids handle their first midlife crisis before we jump to too much of a conclusion, job done and dusted. And so the point that I'm really making here is that the design of a system that sees parenting support as accessible across the lifespan, we've only got really evidence-based practices up to the teenage years. But what about young adults? And what about young adults who've moved out of home and then come back to live at home? Well, parenting problems don't cease because your kids have happened to be adults. They can be revolting, living with you in a demanding, pushy, entitled, escalative way, and parenting challenges continue to exist. Now, when you look at the evidence that is evolving around this notion of taking a population perspective, essentially there are three key studies, the most recent of which was conducted in Ireland, central counties in Ireland, showing about a 37% reduction in the kids at a population level who had serious mental health problems as assessed by the SDQ. Now that approach that essentially targeted the transition to school period from kids about age 3 to age 9 and delivered it essentially through seminars like are being rolled out here, discussion groups and the group program, was associated with a highly significant reduction in the level of mental health problems in children in that community. There's been other studies demonstrating impact on prevalence rates of child maltreatment and mental health problems, both in the US and in Australia. But the thing that I'd just like to draw to your attention is that all of these studies involve a blending of universal and targeted programs. So it's never going to be a question of just having a universal offer or a pointy-end offer with the most vulnerable, most difficult families. We're working on a new program variant at the moment of Triple P called Life Skills Triple P for adults who've had histories of high levels of ACEs. These are the adverse childhood experiences, 10 of them. Growing up in a household where there's been child maltreatment, growing up in a household where a parent's had a mental illness, a substance abuse problem, been incarcerated, where there's been family violence or where there's been a breakup of the relationship. Now the thought that you needed a specific level 5 intervention tool to be able to work with the most vulnerable end of the spectrum has been brought upon partly because these families generally have been difficult to engage in parenting programs. But it does not mean that a parenting solution is not a very critical part of a rehabilitation program for someone with a substance abuse problem or a serious mental health problem. It's almost as though we treat these adult problems as though they exist in isolation, as though they don't live in families, as though they're not parents. When we know the offspring of people who have high levels of ACEs, we know that they can recreate the same adversities within their own children. So you've got a double whammy problem. You've got parents with family of origin histories of high levels of ACEs now parenting their children, and the sequelae of that history is emotional dysregulation and difficulties with self-regulation, now being recreated with the raising of their own children. So the thought of developing an enhanced level of a group program at level 5 is what we're involved in right at the moment. The other thing that I'd just say about systems design and the principles of positive parenting, there are these 5. I'm not going to sort of repeat them for you other than to draw to your attention that these have applications across a very diverse range of referral problems and types of difficulties that children have. And that when we think about the customisation of a parenting intervention to take into account the nuances of how a case is being presented, one thing to tune into is that the better the understanding we have of the modifiable determinants of parenting, the greater the capacity we have to adjust and customise what we're doing. So this diagram, when it reappears, will show in the centre parenting behaviour, affect and cognition. And then around the outside, we can think of the biological characteristics of the parent, their genetics and personality, how sociable they are, the extent to which the parent has health-related difficulties. We can think of the relatively non-modifiable characteristics of the children that they're interacting with. But then we can think about the broad range of factors that a parenting intervention may seek to move. And these include the interactional processes that happen between parents and children. And just one thing that I'll mention here is that every time we think about teaching a parenting skill, we should think about the reciprocal skill the child is practicing. So if we think about descriptive praise, from a child's perspective, they're learning to receive a compliment. They're learning to receive it in a non-boastful way. They're learning to receive it in an appropriate way that doesn't court further rejection. When we're thinking about kids, parents giving clear, calm instructions and directions, children are practicing the skills of attending, of listening to what's being asked, of being able to determine whether what I've been asked is appropriate, whether the person who's asking me is a trustworthy person. So that all of those things, that every parenting skill needs to be justifiable from a child benefit perspective. And you can go through every one of the skills that we might like to include in a parenting program to make sure that happens. Then we can think about the design of the program to make sure that the other factors that are related to parents being able to change are taken into account, including their cognitions, their expectations, their beliefs, their assumptions, their attributions. These are modifiable cognitive factors, relationship variables that have to do with whether you're doing it alone, with a buddy, with support, with a partner involved. You can either vary whether or not this occurs or make it allowable and encourage it. You can think about the context wherein families are learning parenting skills, but not so much from just the perspective of managing your kids, but have you ever thought about managing your kids from the perspective of job seeking for a parent? Because if you've got kids who are out of control and no one can look after them or wants to look after them, you can't even search for work, let alone go to work. So that there are sequelae that are associated with the lived context that families are in. If we think about parenting skills from the perspective of parental mental health, when we've got parents who are meeting diagnostic criteria for depression, for major depression, dysthymic disorder, panic disorder, thinking about parents who've got problems with bipolar problems, should we be asking to what extent are elevations in parenting problems with kids related to fluctuations in the parent's mood, an onset of mental health problems, or to what extent has deterioration in parents' mental health been associated with deteriorations in children's behaviour? Kids getting into strife, kids having disrupted sleep patterns, so parents are exhausted, overwhelmed, can't sleep at all. They argue with their partners because no one knows how to deal with the nighttime wake-ups and so on. So all I'm saying is that when we're thinking about context, we're thinking about assessment of families and where they're at, individual differences will play out in terms of biology and genetics. They'll play out in terms of interactional processes, cognition, relationship factors, mental health, and the extent to which people have adverse childhood family of origin experiences. We can talk about having grown up in a rotten family, but you can still be interacting with that rotten family as an adult. And you can have toxic relationships with your own parents. You can be living in a multi-family household where there's substance abuse, where there are needles, where there are adults who are behaving very badly in the presence of children. And we think about, okay, well, how does that relate to what we need to be attending to in the delivery of a parenting program? We can think about differences in self-regulatory capacity of a parent. Contrast this difference. A parent comes to see us and says, look, I went to your talk on the power of positive parenting about a month ago, and I thought it was great at the time, and I wrote down a lot of things that I thought were really important. And we put a number of them in place, and things were great for about the first week, and then it's gone pear-shaped. It's just not working. I've tried this, and this, worked for a few days, and then it kind of stopped. And can you help me? Is there something that we're doing that we need to do differently? You got any suggestions on how we tackle this problem? That's a very different parent to this parent. And you say, how are you going? How can I help you? And the parent says, I've just had it with these kids. I'm so over the parenting. If I could outsource the lot today, I would. And, we've tried everything. Nothing works. Nothing at all. And I'm convinced it never will. You think about that from a self-regulation perspective. The first parent is a troubleshooter, a problem solver. She's tried things, is prepared to and is open to suggestion, ideas, fine-tuning of things that they've tried previously. The second parent is defeated, feels overwhelmed, feels no personal capacity to turn things around. It does not mean that that second parent, a self-regulation approach is not relevant. It's just to get to the point of self-regulatory capability may be a longer course for that parent. But the fact that people can develop a sense of future, of personal destiny, of being able to turn around things that are difficult is something that we absolutely need to build into the way in which we work with parents. And that means attunement to the cultural context of the beliefs and traditions and ways in which things are done in particular cultures. Now, the one thing about positive parenting that has been truly remarkable to me is to recognise that the same program that works with Western families with individual ideas about child accomplishment and so on seem to produce very similar effect sizes in more collectivistic cultures. So Triple P's been used in many different cultural contexts. The country with the largest effect sizes are relating to the trialling of group Triple P. Guess where it was? In Iran, in a Muslim culture. And then you start to think about when people say, our families, they're very different here. That's all very well of what you've done in Brisbane or on the trial, but, these families on the south side of the river, they're completely different than people who live over the other side. And localism works everywhere. When we first did the trial work in South Carolina with our Aussie videos and Aussie accents and that kind of thing, people were saying to us in South Carolina, the African Americans won't relate to this. No way. There's not enough black faces. They'll just definitely not relate to it. This is the practitioners, of course, saying this. You know what the actual experience of it was? The absolute opposite. They loved it. They saw it like a TV show. And I tell you, the accents related better to people in the south of the US than a New York accent did. And the thing that I'd just like to draw to your attention is what appears to be crucial from parents being prepared to be open to learning is not the colour of the face. It's not the actual culture that is represented. It's the example. It's the context. You can have a massive temper tantrum in downtown Tehran, Tokyo, Sydney, Perth, Brisbane, and it looks very similar. It's universally aversive. The motivational context is usually to get out of the spotlight quickly if you're a parent because it's extremely embarrassing. So what works in that context? Escalation or cave-in, and it turns it off. And so parents are motivated everywhere when you're talking about kids misbehaving in public. It doesn't seem to matter whether it was in New York or Tokyo or whatever, so long as they understood it, they could relate to it, because then they could connect it to their lived journey in their own parenting role. And so this is why trials of our program in Indonesia, in Japan, in Hong Kong, in mainland China have produced very similar results to what we found in Brisbane and you found here in Perth. So if we go back to the point of this slide, it's fundamentally to say that when we think about the modifiable determinants of parenting practices, we need to think about how to incorporate those understandings in the way in which we deliver parenting programs that is following a set of guidelines. So tuning into the broader ecological context helps to do this. Now, the reason that when you think about parenting in context, we can think about parents' lived experience that will mean that there are massive differences across different locations and contexts where parenting is occurring, depending on the following kind of things. You know, how safe a neighbourhood is, the level of violence that exists in the community, the kinds and range of parenting services that might exist, the level of social infrastructure, the level of poverty that might occur. I can remember about 3 years ago now, we were starting to do some work in Kenya, and a trial was taking place, or we were preparing for a trial in the slums of Nairobi. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Kenya. Anyone been to Nairobi here? Anyone seen the slum areas? You sort of know what they look very similar in most parts of the world that have really impoverished areas. But one thing that everyone had told us is saying, look, remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? You can't attend to these things to do with parenting programs and kids achieving higher levels of accomplishment and so on if their basic needs are not being addressed in terms of food and shelter and so on. Now, you go into an impoverished environment and you ask parents who live in that place what's important to them. And this is what we did. I asked one of the parents there, I said, look, what are the important parenting issues for you in raising your kids living here? And I'll never forget, this mum said to me, look, I want my kids to stop searching for food in the rubbish dump and go to school. And I said, okay, and if you were able to achieve that, what else would be important? You know what she said? Well, they're fighting all the time. They won't go to bed on time. And I'm arguing and yelling at them. And I thought, gee, that sounds vaguely familiar. And so parents can be in a very, very vulnerable and disadvantaged context. They can be in a moment of transition, for example, after a bushfire, after a flood, after a cyclone, through the process of war. And for those parents, it's still important, their relationship with their kids. And they may be hungry, but you have a protective response that exists to having to do with your children's survival and well-being that's very important. And so I think we need to stop thinking about this hierarchically and start thinking about it in terms of the importance of the delivery of parenting programs for all levels of need that exist within the community, including those parents whose children are near death. And what does good parenting in that context actually look like? So when we start to think about the design of programs that will create and eliminate barriers and facilitate enablers, what have we got what are the moving parts that we can think about that might make a difference? Okay, and I'll come back to these in a moment. But there are 5 things on that inner circle, ranging from the nature of parent concerns right through to the level of motivation that parents have, and we'll talk about program options that will achieve these different kinds of outcomes. But before I do that, I just want to highlight for a moment one of the things that meta-analysis has shown us of the evaluation of the work that we do when you talk about change in parenting through the vehicle of shifting relationships between parents and children and the parents developing a range of parenting skills. The thing that our evidence has shown in multiple meta-analyses now is that harsh coercive parenting decreases. You get an increase in parental self-efficacy, so a greater level of confidence. You get more positive parenting, better teamwork, even if only one parent has been involved, lower family conflict, and a greater sense of parental well-being. Now, it could be that one of the most powerful ways of mobilizing social change within our community is through the vehicle of parenting activating other community processes that will support parents feeling valued and that parenting is considered an important issue in this place. This will build a greater sense of community social capital as you've got more people with training and evidence-based practices, and increase social cohesion and trust within a community, social support within for parents in participating in parenting programs. And then if you think about it from a collective efficacy perspective, that we as a community have a belief we have the knowledge, skills and capacity to deal with the issues that our children face and the problems we have with our kids. So when that happens, the evidence to date suggests that population level change really hits three main targets. Reduce child maltreatment in a community, improvements in mental health, and improved school outcomes. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the delivery of Triple P in the context of schooling is that, and I understand there are a number of people from schools here, school psychologists and others who are delivering parenting programs in schools. There's now a really strong converging body of evidence to show that the strength and quality of the relationship between parents and teachers and schools really influences outcomes for children in the school environment, including literacy, numeracy, school attendance, and kind of behavioural problems within the school environment. So, I'd just like to go back to fundamentally a question of individual differences. And this, of course, has to do with really determining what programs work best for whom, but it is not a straightforward question. And so this is a way of framing of it. What intervention delivered by whom, in which setting, at what age, via which delivery modality, is effective with what child, parent or family problem and in which cultural context? Straightforward, isn't it? So does it work? Well, the research can only tell us so much about this. And this is in an environment of all of the psychosocial interventions, we've probably got more evidence relating to impact with a very diverse range of children, starting from conduct problems, moving through to kids with eczema, diabetes and chronic health problems. And these are the range of problems that have been addressed by our intervention program and that are supported by trial data. So you're thinking about a common set of skills but being applied to very diverse outcomes in families. And so it's not just the child outcomes that are important. It's also thinking that when you think about a parenting program, the great emphasis has usually been on the parent-child relationship. But the parent-child relationship is a vehicle for influencing other relationships. And those other relationships will include the child's relationship with their siblings, the child's relationship with the peer group, the child's relationships with their grandparents, the child's relationship with teachers. How about the child's relationship with their sports coach, music teacher? Anyone else who's involved in the education and care and nurturing of children can learn parenting skills that promote sociability of children and better emotion regulation. And so if we stop thinking about parenting just from the perspective of the parent-child relationship and family relationships and think about it much more broadly, because I tell you there's another set of relationships that most parenting researchers haven't even considered. That is children's relationship with the natural world, the natural environment, the destruction of our coral reefs, the destruction of species of animals around the world, the care of pets. And you think about this as a vehicle for accomplishing change within a family, Well, we'll talk about how this can be made to occur. The other thing that I'd just like to highlight for a moment is that, you know, a lot of people put up their hand and say, look, I work with vulnerable families. I work at the pointy end of the socioeconomic spectrum of families on the edge of care, or some circumstance that makes those families particularly vulnerable. But remember, vulnerability is not a single characteristic or quality of an individual. You can have vulnerability that stems from the nature of the children. You know, for example, kids who are preterm or born with a developmental disability, or have serious early onset conduct problems and developmental difficulties. The parenting of those children is different and is challenging for parents. I mean, I've got a nephew who's had triplets, and the parenting of triplets when they've got an older sibling already, 4 kids, is a real challenge when you're thinking about applying principles of positive parenting. You know, do you do it in a group? Do you knock them off one at a time? I mean, there's lots of challenges that exist that are not too dissimilar of basically having kids who are close in age to deal with. But then we think about the parent themselves, and those parents can differ in terms of their stress and anxiety, the level of discord between them and their partners, whether this is a parent who's had an abuse history, whether they've been substance abusing parents, whether they're a minority parents, Indigenous, whether they're a grandparent, foster parent, adoptive parent, and so on. And then what kind of family context is it occurring in? You know, is the family experienced being disrupted because a parent is incarcerated, or a parent is on a tour of duty in the armed forces or something like that? So it's the interaction of the child, parent and family variables that might define different kinds of vulnerability. And if we lump them all together and say we work with vulnerable families, then we're missing the fact that there can be vulnerable families who are actually wealthy and produce kids. They're middle-class families, but they produce kids who commit suicide, who develop depression, who develop eating disorders. So the assumption that this vulnerability is just concentrated in the lowest quintile of the income distribution is contradicted by knowledge about the spread of these problems throughout the community. In fact, I'd say it even more strongly. We could just target the lowest quintile of the income distribution and invest all our resources in trying to address the parenting issues of the poorest families and not shift the prevalence rates of these problems at a population level, mainly because the vast majority of the population are in the other 3/4 of the income distribution. So when we start thinking about aspirations for why parents might want to participate in a parenting program, and you start to think, well, how does this apply to a homegrown program like ours? The thing that I'd just like to draw to your attention is something that started as a PhD thesis in 1978 of mine, to have reached a point now where research has been done in 36 countries. There are 305 evaluation studies across 419 institutions. There are 900 papers that have been written on it involving 1,300 authors. There are 155 randomised trials, 96% of which show positive effects, 4% show null effects, 50% have had no developer involvement. We're talking about a massive scientific evidence base relating to an approach to supporting the parenting role that is not a simple one-size-fits-all, where you could conveniently characterise this program as having this pattern of features and being missing a whole lot of others. So the key message here is that population-based, multi-level systems of parenting support provide flexible options to cater for individual differences in the needs of parents and children. And that's what it should do. Now, when I say flexible options, it doesn't mean that all possibilities have been taken into account. It can't possibly do that. There are some very rare circumstances that families and children find themselves in that are extremely hard to study because they're low prevalence problems. They're hard to form, proper groups in a randomised trial and so on. I'm thinking of kids with terminal illnesses, kids with cystic fibrosis, kids with a whole range of chronic syndromes developmental disabilities and syndromes that are very rare events. They can't be studied in randomised trials because you can't, in a place like Perth or in Brisbane, you just can't get the sample size. Maybe internationally you can. Right. Now let's move on to program content and thinking about flexible delivery in a need-responsive manner here. So tailoring a program content to specific needs, I suppose the best way of thinking about this is that in a program like ours, which is, say, 17 core strategies, not all of those strategies are relevant to the parents' current issues that they're confronting with a particular child. They may be relevant in 6 months, and they may be relevant with a different sibling, but the focus of the parental attention at the moment may not call on those skills to be deployed. So you may not need to do something like a behavioural contract. You may not need to be using ask, say, do as a way of teaching kids to dress themselves or brush their teeth. But if one of those children happened to have a developmental disability and was struggling with dressing and toileting and so on, those skills become highly relevant. And so within an individual group where you've got parents who have mixed kind of concerns with their kids, the strategy that we selected is create a menu, create a smorgasbord of options, and have every option included there because it may have some potential application right now and also in the future. And what you're doing is creating a circumstance where the parent themselves has a diverse range of less formularised options that they can bring together in a coordinated parenting plan put in place without us having to be there to scaffold and to help the parent navigate that process. So tailoring of content comes to use of clear, relevant examples. I remember in Hong Kong when we first did some training there, and we used to teach planned activities training the notion of taking kids shopping. I remember the nurses saying to me, we shouldn't use shopping as an example, that's our life. And, but use going visiting, that's really hard. And so the example selection to use in planned activities training can vary as a function of local context and input. Supplement whatever examples are in manuals or in videos or in tip sheets with other examples to illustrate effective and ineffective use of the strategy. The reason I'm saying look for other examples, in so doing, what you're doing is creating multiple exemplars of the same principle. Now, the thing about using what's called sufficient exemplar training, it actually promotes transfer of learning. So if you are teaching about praise and encouragement and you're teaching that skill, don't just, because you know the parents of a toddler or a preschooler, don't just use an example from that age group. Use one from that age group supplemented by one with a teenager and an adult. And so that the parent sees that this is a skill that could be diversely applied, and then the corollary of that is, and when shouldn't you use it? So it's always not just when to use it, but when not to use it. When is it not appropriate to use? Now, if you've got a kid who's coming in and they've just, I don't know, my grandson, we're sort of a rugby union family, and I go and watch the grandkids play rugby and stuff, and this kid scores lots of tries. He's only 6, but he can score 10 tries in a game. And he comes back and he's telling my wife Trish, about the game and the tries he scored, and he's got a big smile on his face and he's describing exactly what happens. I don't think I need to say anything because he's already motivated by an audience that has to do with attention and approval. He doesn't need a supplementary and granddad saying, oh yeah, and you're fantastic. Say it again in different words. So the idea is, what's the minimally sufficient level of consequation that's just enough to enable kids to maintain a skill or behaviour without reliance on external, reminders and congratulations. This is how you stop kids becoming dependent upon praise. And okay, so the other thing that I'd just say here is that the cultural relevance of examples, it's interesting that what I'd say about cultural diversity is don't make too many assumptions. Don't make an assumption because a person is from a particular religion or a particular ethnic group that they will have the same level of buy-in or the same level of commitment to culturally based values that seem to be culturally normative within that group. Just so think about heterogeneity within individual subgroups. So rather than thinking about, I'll give you an example. A few years ago I was running a workshop for professionals in the north of the South Island of New Zealand in a place called Nelson. And we were talking about working with Maori. And I can remember this was a group of special educators and school psychologists, there were a few clinical psychologists there, but there's a very passionate discussion going on about how you have to, in order to work with Maori, you've got to work with iwi, you've got to work with the broader tribal group and elders and this kind of thing. And there was a kind of a strong statements about the critical importance of doing this. And this was coming from all the Pākehās in the room, which are the Europeans. There were a few Maori practitioners in the room, and they were very silent when all this discussion was going on. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so I went up to this guy when we had a break, and I said, gee, I'm really curious about this issue of, how would you prefer to receive parenting support? If you're having problems with one of your kids, as you've heard what people are saying in there, what's your take on all of this? And you know what he said? He said, I'd jump on a plane and I'd come to Brisbane to see you. And it was sort of like the assumption that had been made is that this is the cultural way of doing things without ever checking it out. And so one of the advantages of allowing the families we work with to educate us about what the cultural issues are that are salient to them, it means that within any one group of a diverse range of families, you can have different levels of commitment to traditional cultural values and practices, and that's okay. Because sometimes you can get this enormous social pressure for everyone to be the same with respect to observance of particular ways of doing things. So diversity and heterogeneity within groups is also important to recognise. And the way I look at it, it's a bit like saying, when someone you're overseeing says, oh, what's the Aussie way of raising kids? Well, it's a meaningless question, isn't it? It's sort of, there's lots of different ways of parenting kids that we see here. Okay, another thing that I'd just like to draw to your attention has to do with the way in which we respond to specific questions from parents about strategies or examples, where parents say, oh yeah, that's okay, that time out or that quiet time, or using logical consequences or whatever, but it doesn't work with my child. He has ADHD, or he's on the spectrum, he's got this, that and the other. There's some unique circumstance that the parent is exceptionalising and saying, that's all very well, but. And then the skill of the practitioner there has to do with clarifying the referent of the parent of what it is they're meaning when they say that and it won't work. Because sometimes we jump to a conclusion about what we think the parent has actually said or saying that's not correct. I can remember working an individual program with a parent, and we were reviewing the 10 core positive strategies for encouraging kids and teaching new skills. The parent said, oh, that won't work for my child. And I was curious about this, and I said, well, when you say that, what are you referring to? Are you referring to praise, or are you referring to physical affection, or when you say that, what are you meaning? And you know what she said? She said, I have always loved my child. And it was kind of like she had heard something different than was actually being conveyed. And she was thinking that because I was suggesting different ways of encouraging and being positive and showing affection, that there was a subtext that she wasn't loving her kid as much. And the only way of flushing that out was to clarify the referent. And once she clarified the referent, then I could clarify my meaning. And she was able to say, oh, yeah, okay, I see what you mean now. And because she felt she was being criticised, and she wasn't at all. So that's an example of individual tailoring in the context of just something as basic as how you respond to a parent question. I'll tell you some now high-risk adaptations of content. Advising a parent that they must or must not use certain parenting strategies. So we've worked with organisations who said, look, that's great. We love strategies 1 to 15, but can you just blacken out quiet time and time out, thanks? And you think, oh, that's interesting. On what basis are you making that call? And sometimes it's, because it destroys attachment. No evidence to support that. Sometimes it's on the basis of, it disrupts kids' capacity to self-regulate emotion, where most of the evidence shows the opposite effects occur when it's done properly in a positive relationship. Sometimes it's because, that's all very well if they're working with a professional, but if you're doing it with, in public messaging and so on, a lot of parents don't do it properly and they'll get it wrong, so we should not talk to them about it. Well, I've got a different view on this. It's not our call. Who are we to tell parents what it is they must and must not do, or that's considered to be effective, when you've got a strategy such as time out, which is used in every evidence-based parenting intervention that has been shown to work and produce durable effects, is widely used in the community, where parents have seen it anyway on TV, done poorly with Super Nanny, and then we're going to pretend it doesn't exist. Aren't we better to put it out in the open and talk about how to make it work and fail? Because for every strategy, and it's not just a time-out issue, every strategy you can make fail. You can make praise fail. You can make physical affection fail. You can do it too much. You can do it too hard, too long. So kids, love a bit of tickling. They hate it when you go on and it becomes, kind of when the dad doesn't know when to stop. And so the point that I'm making is that if we're respectful of parents, we don't withhold information from them. We share it as an open system and we allow them to form their own conclusions about what combinations are going to work best. And it's absolutely fine for a parent to choose not to use a particular strategy for a reason and because they've formed that conclusion. And so all I'm suggesting here is that parenting support is not about prescribing what must be done. It's about creating an invitation for parents to reflect on their current practices in raising their children and come together with the right combinations of strategies that are going to work for them. So withholding information or resources from parents because the practitioner believes it's less relevant and useful is not a good idea, particularly when what's in the program offers might not be relevant today, but it could be highly relevant tomorrow. Suggesting adaptations to strategies that deviate from principles of the strategy. So for example, trying to say, look, it's fine to use timeout, but if the kids get really upset, go in there and hold them and reassure them and cuddle them and nurture them and that kind of stuff, when there's absolutely no evidence that that kind of approach enhances the effects of timeout, improves children's capacity to self-regulate emotion, or improves attachment in any way. So the thing that I'd also add to that is that just because an idea sounds good, looks good and feels good doesn't mean it works and it doesn't mean it enhances outcomes. A couple of years ago we did a trial from Victoria University in Wellington with a colleague, Karen Salmon, and Cassie Didman, on looking at Group Triple P and asking the question, if you combined emotion coaching to teach emotional literacy to children and have lots of conversations about emotions, would it improve the outcome for children and would it enhance their capacity to decode emotional cues and so on? We found no additive effect whatsoever. It made it a more complex intervention to deliver because there was more being done, but there was no clear evidence that adding this improved the outcome. So in theory, it sounded great. I mean, we know kids with conduct-related problems have difficulty with decoding emotional signals and so on. But it was interesting that the kids who were just going through the regular program achieved a similar outcome on those same measures. And similarly with a program that was trialled in Dunedin, focusing on teaching executive function and self-regulation to kids with ADHD. Compared it to regular group triple P, similar outcomes on the same measures of executive function. So that sometimes you can have a targeted adjunctive intervention that seems in theory to enhance capacity to produce a better outcome, but it doesn't necessarily do so. And the approach that we've taken is that let's not add in things that we can't create an evidence base for. And that's the way we've approached it. And finally, let's turn to the issue of now process issues to do with ensuring delivery is responsive to need. Now, the important process issues relating to responsive delivery include the following: the quality of the parent-practitioner relationship. So if we're actually in a service and we're engaging with parents, to be respectful, empathic, caring, tailoring our information to individual parents' needs, really important. But let's not overvalue the importance of the practitioner-parent relationship, because if we do and we say that's absolutely vital in order to produce change, we'll ignore all of the evidence relating to online interventions that involve no practitioner at all, that have produced comparable outcomes on the same measures for kids with similar problems. Secondly, appropriate use of case assessment information to identify unique needs and issues and problems that need to be addressed or taken into account in delivery of the program. The fact that parents are entering our programs, sometimes with screening, sometimes with case histories being taken, mean that knowledge as a practitioner can always be utilised in understanding the learner that we have in the group. Practitioner skill in the delivery of the program is important. I mean, how can we encourage practitioners to deliver the program in an interesting and well-paced way in terms of the material being introduced, the appropriate use of humour, sometimes appropriate self-disclosure. But you can have self-disclosure that's highly inappropriate, that goes on to talk almost like about, you know, when a practitioner gets up and say, oh, well, my kids were nearly removed from me, and they, you know, and you're going on, you think, okay, is this a parent who's, is this a professional, who's has actual expertise in the area of working with parents? I mean, if you're coming in as a peer-to-peer and the parent is being involved in the delivery of the program, different story. You can have all sorts of narratives relating to the journey that that person is being on, but in a professional role, you can get just a little bit too much self-disclosure in a way that can create actually further problems for the practitioner later on in terms of the kinds of questions that parents may ask that practitioner. Relevant but varied examples, that's the idea of training loosely, training sufficient exemplars so you've got more flexibility being created in the parent's consideration of how to apply the program. If you're going to do live modelling of a skill, make sure you know the skill properly. And that if you're going to do a demo and you say, okay, the video's not quite appropriate for this group, I'm going to show you how to do it. And this is the way we used to do it before we had videos. We did live demos. But I tell you, make sure you select someone from the audience you've primed to do this. Otherwise, you can get people coming up and they're trying to prove how rotten they can be, and they actually make the demonstration really difficult. You know, you get a big heavy man coming up with a lighter woman, and it's a kind of, you're trying to demonstrate the start routine of asking once, asking twice and backing up, and the guy just flops on the ground on his back like this. And, you know, and you're supposed to be demonstrating how you move a child who's resisting going into time. Well, you can't do it. But you've been set up. You've been set up because they're testing you. Whereas if you have someone who's a little bit primed to say, look, this is what we're trying to demonstrate, and you give them a little run through of what the protocol is, then you'll get cooperative people who are enabling you to actually demonstrate the skill you want people to learn. Okay, provide clear answers to parents' questions about use of strategies. So if a parent says, well, how long can you leave a child into timeout for? Or how many times should you be asking a child to do something before you back up? Well, give an answer that's consistent with the program. You need to understand enough about the program content to be able to give an answer that's appropriate. Let me just give you an example of what can happen if you don't follow the process of the delivery of the program. I remember a few years ago in Brisbane, I got a telephone call from a parent who was participating in South Brisbane, somewhere down in Logan, in a program delivered, the group program delivered through the school. And the parent was ringing up. She was most concerned about what this practitioner, a guidance officer, had said to the group at the last session. She said, "Oh, we've done the first four sessions of the group, but we're just going to ignore doing the phone calls. You know, that's not needed." And the parent rang me up and she said, "But it says on page 52, we're going to get some phone calls." And she said, "Do you realise that this person is doing this to your program?" And I think, "Oh no." And it was kind of like, we can't assume that when parents hear about an evidence-based program, they don't develop expectations of what proper delivery of it is about. And so if you think that parents don't care and it doesn't matter and you've got all the license in the world to change whatever you like, be prepared for people to complain, and be prepared for people to complain above your station in your work, particularly once the news about positive parenting becomes much more widely available. Do you know what we're shooting for? Is for parents to be as hungry for good quality parent education as they are for good quality schools for their kids. And when parents truly realise the benefits of positive parenting for all of these diverse aspects of children's development, their relationships, their language, their accomplishments at school, their capacity to be successful, avoid problems in the future, this is something that will become not only a highly sought after resource, but something that will shift the standards of professional delivery of parenting programs from here to here. Because once consumer demand for high quality evidence-based programs is out there, and once these programs are being delivered on a wider scale, parents' expectations of what a good program will look like should change. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want more informed, educated consumers who know what high quality parenting programs are like. And it's not just about the popularity contest of exiting from a program saying, "Oh, that was wonderful, you were so helpful," and you know, that's great, you know, you've been very helpful. But have we ever thought what's behind that question or that observation? You have really helped my child. Thank you, thank you, thank you. What's the parent attributing change to? Are they attributing change in their child to you or their own efforts? Are they owning the kind of changes that they've made to make the benefit to children possible? And so whenever we sort of get that kind of message from a parent of the thank yous, perhaps we should just acknowledge that and say, "Oh, thank you for saying that, but tell me, what is it that you've been doing that has really enabled this to occur?" Because that's what is going to carry you forward from now. And remember, most parenting programs are temporary and transitional moments in people's lives. They're not permanent states of being. So we have to plan for exiting. We have to plan for letting go, letting people be able to have wings to fly, not to flap under instruction or direction or support or nurturance. The other thing that I'll just mention here is about the management of within-session resistance. We've talked a little bit about clarifying the referent, but you know, with running any kind of group program, you'll get differences in things like the level of contribution that a parent makes. Some talk a lot, some hardly say anything, and you're thinking of the challenge of running a group to ensure that people have an equal opportunity to say something. And you know, there's a whole variety of tactics you can use to decrease the contribution of an over-talkative person, or increase the contribution of someone who's really quiet. And I mean, they range from things like inviting a contribution that's easy entry, soft entry, that enables a person to pretty much say yes or no to something without having to elaborate, and reinforcing that, and then inviting again, a little bit more demanding a question. And then for the person who's contributing a lot, inviting the group to contribute while you're standing behind them. so you haven't got eye contact. Because if you don't have eye contact and engagement with the person, they can't jump in, and it's easier to say, and what do the rest of you think? Is that the kind of... There's a whole range of strategies that have to do with the skilled running of a group. Now, I mean, we've had a classic example here today of technology challenges. And if you're running a parenting program and you've got a group of parents in a seminar and you've got, 100 people or whatever, and this is flicking on and off, there's a technology problem that exists within the site that even early arrival here couldn't sort. And so everyone has to be able to deal with it sort of coming on and off. Fortunately, it's on my screen all the time. But I can remember being in Darwin once at a conference doing a keynote address to early educators, and not only did the PowerPoint not work, but my computer didn't work. And so I was giving an hour keynote address with no notes and just completely off the cuff. And you think, how in the hell do you get to a point where you can actually handle that situation without totally freaking out? And there's something about knowledge and experience and being able to have your knowledge consolidated well enough so you can actually think in the moment. You can think off the cuff. You can just bring examples from all over the place. And, it would probably not have mattered if there were no PowerPoints here today for you to refer to, because I could still have basically delivered what I'm delivering now. But the point I'm making about organisation and planning, if you're running a program, just to know the site, to get there early, troubleshoot all the technology things. I've run many parenting seminars across our state recently, and I've got to say one of the worst places for doing it, not from the fact that there's not great support, enthusiasm, but from a purely technology point of view, are schools. And, we've had situations arriving to school and no one's got the key to the library and you can't get in. The PowerPoints, what I like is to have it right in front of me, and then you've got something, you can't have it there, it's got to be behind, so you're having to do this all the time to the audience. It's not good. Even with advance warning and organisation and planning around it, you can still, on the night, have a problem. So you've got to have flexible skills to handle technology if you're going to use it at all in what you're doing and not be thrown by it. All right. Look, there's another way of thinking about adaptation, and it's the way in which we design the whole system. And it's the principle of minimal sufficiency. Now, if you think about it like this, the program content in the various iterations of PPP are all kind of manualised. Start with that, and if you're having to make adaptations, make the minimally sufficient level of adaptation that enables you to continue to deliver it with structure, with fidelity, with the program content being delivered as it were designed. But of course there are things that you could vary. You could vary the number of sessions, for example. You could negotiate, do an extra session with a family, not a problem. You could devote more time to individual activities within a session. If clearly the parents have got a particular thing but are struggling with something else, you can spend a little bit more time on another activity. But make that decision evidence-based, so it's based on your observation of what the parents can actually do, not what they just tell you they can do. You can vary the session length by negotiation. I mean, the Power of Positive Parenting seminars are often promoted as a 90-minute session. But if you want to promote them as a 2-hour session, it's not a problem. You have more time for questions and things and Q&A. But if you want to keep it to the way it was designed, then it's accomplishable within a 90-minute time frame. Consider the method of delivery that's going to work for the population you're working with. Most of the programs can be delivered in diverse delivery formats. You can deliver it over the phone, through the internet and so on. Select methods of assessing outcome that are appropriate to the problem that you're working with. So, for example, if you're thinking about a family where a child has anxiety, We've got a new program called Fearless Triple P, which is a program for kids with diagnosed anxiety disorders who are in the primary school age group, which will be coming out early next year. 6-session group program, parent only, works extremely well. But it's kind of, the assessment tools are different because we're dealing with anxiety, not, externalising behaviour problems. Consider the flexibility that stems from having multiple carers or a family group that's involved in delivery of a group program. There's nothing in the manual or nothing in the world of restricted practice which would suggest that you can't include all relevant carers who are involved in the lives of children. There's a lot of evidence now, in fact from 3 RCTs that show grandparents do really well with Triple P. It improves their relationship with their own adult kids and their grandkids. And if we think about parenting for life, the long-term commitment of the older generation in raising our families, raising our grandchildren is extremely important in many families still. These are the high-risk things to avoid: changing the content and order, changing the sequence, picking out strategies, adding new ones that are not part of the program. What would it be? Is it okay if we take a prayer break? Is it okay if I get a nutritionist to come in and talk about this fantastic new substance that's available through, and she's selling? Don't do that. Don't mix a positive parenting program with other auxiliary things. If you want to do that, do it before it, separate, or after it, but not to confuse parents that this part of the program. Failing to set out any plan, any agenda. The thing is, it makes it easier for people to learn if they know where they're heading, if there's a little bit of structure, and they know that, if you have a bit of an agenda, it's no point in having one if you simply abandon it. Quite often, I've seen people start a group program and they start off with, how's everything been in the last week? That can take an hour for people to go through. And if you just simply allow people to go on and on and on, and you think, oh God, this is just another example of what she said last week, it's redundant, interesting, redundant. How many times do we need to hear it? And people like a bit of airspace. So, there's no end to people's capacity to have a whinge, complain about their kids and how difficult life is. It's quite a different thing when you focus them on new learning and turning things around. Another problem would be where parents say, I've got a good one for you, and they just fire questions at you all the time. And the great temptation is to provide the answer all the time, when in fact it might be a question about something you've already introduced previously. And then you can use that question to prompt the parent to consider how we learned last week about managing taking kids shopping and apply it to how we travel in the bus or go visiting. So those exemplars will be occasions for prompting self-regulatory process. If, however, you continue to use this prompting approach to try to get the parent to discover it, boy, that can be really difficult. How do you think it should be done? And what do the rest of you think? And it goes on and on and on. You're prompting and feeding the group, and they've just said something basic like, the analogy would be, you go to your mechanic with your car and you say to the mechanic, can you change the car tyre for me? And the mechanic says, oh, that's an interesting question. How do other people change their car tyres? And, and prompt a whole lot of questions about something where you just want them to change your tyre or to tell you how to do it. So if you keep the prompting up too much, the principle, 2 prompts and give it to them. If they haven't got it after 2 prompts, don't keep flogging a dead horse. It won't produce better learning. So the overuse of prompts is a problem. The other thing that's a real problem is don't set homework for people unless you're prepared to review it. Because if you don't review it, the message you carry with it, this is not important. It's a bit like kids doing homework and the teacher doesn't look at it the next day and doesn't review it. It's always a problem. Okay, so I'll just cherry pick a little bit here because we're getting towards the end, and I wanted to make sure that we have a little bit of time for for discussion and questions. Just another principle that I draw to your attention: whenever you're introducing something, always provide a clear rationale for why, not just the what, but the why. What the skill is and why it's important. And so whenever you think about you as an educator, as a parenting support person, there's one thing that I would encourage you all to do, and that is stockpile good exemplars, good examples. For every skill, you should have at least 4 or 5 examples that you can roll out for any age group. And so that it means that within your own delivery, you can keep it fresh, you can keep it alive, you can always use different ways of illustrating the same thing that creates psychological flexibility within the audience as well. Okay. All right. So I think at this point, I've got a little bit more that I wanted to say about self-regulation, but I think I'll just jump through I'm going to jump through a couple of slides here to take you to the issue of application, flexible application that will apply best. So I'm just going to skip here for a moment. And I just want to talk to you briefly about this issue of cultural diversity and how to respond to it. Now, the New Zealand government, through the Ministry of Health, had an initiative around the drivers of crime that involved the delivery of 2 evidence-based parenting programs. One was Incredible Years, Carolyn Webster Stratton's program. The other was Primary Care Triple P. And the question was, could Triple P be delivered in a culturally appropriate manner to Maori? And would we test this intervention with Maoris living in the families living in the north of New Zealand in Whangarei and Kawakawa? And so we worked with the Ngāta Hine Trust, which is funded by government to deliver a whole range of health and education services to Maori whānau in the Kawakawa area in the north of New Zealand. And so what was the outcome? If I tell you what it was, we went through this cultural adaptation process to develop and adapt Triple P, test it in a randomised trial and share the findings with government in Wellington. And the issue that I just wanted to draw to your attention is how a collaborative partnering process can be successful in designing and testing and then disseminating an evidence-based practice. So we call this model CPAM. It's a collaborative partnership adaptation model, and it involved with this particular organisation the establishment of a collaborative relationship, a partnership with the Maori organisation, Ngāta Hine. Part of this process, we reviewed the evidence about effectiveness of Triple P already with Maori families. There wasn't much data available in New Zealand on that. We then reviewed the evidence on cultural adaptation because we knew the program had been successfully deployed in multiple cultural contexts. And there was increasing evidence that evidence-based programs in one cultural context could be scaled effectively in another and transported to another cultural context. But we used focus groups with parents, with elders, with practitioners, and a sampling of a discussion group that could be used as the basis for reflection and discussion about what needed to be same and different. So we took them through a sample program day in the discussion group format. And incidentally, the reason we chose discussion groups as what to trial, even though this was primarily a low-income area in a rural part of New Zealand where there was a lot of crime, there was a lot of involvement in substance abuse and problems with child protection issues, the trust, the elders, did not want any kind of targeted program that will label these families as inadequate or on the risk of at the edge of care. They said, no, we want a universal offer that any parent could do, and that's what we wanted to test. We were prepared to test other things, but that was the cultural advice about what was meaningful there. So we adapted the program, and the adaptations essentially involved no changes to content, but changes in aspects of delivery. So the principles of Triple P were linked to the tikanga of the local iwi or tribe. Now, the tikanga is referring to the Maori way of doing things. And the way in which this needed to change is that culturally appropriate methods of welcoming participants through karakia or prayer, mihi or the welcomes and the getting to know you activities, the elders participated in the delivery of it. And then they wanted a way of connecting the cultural values of the tikanga to principles of Triple P. And the way in which this was done was to create a Maori whare, a meeting house, where the side panels represented the principles of tikanga. And these are things like whānau are autonomous and self-managing, whānau are healthy, whānau look after each other, protect the environment, are nurturing, are financially secure. They're all aspirational goals of the iwi relating to cultural values around parenting. And then they were represented on the side panels. The front framing were the 5 principles of positive parenting, a safe, engaging environment through to taking care of yourself as a parent. And the roof line were the 17 core skills of positive parenting introduced in the program. Now, how the cultural aspects were dealt with the delivery is that everyone had a copy of this diagram, and the practitioner, who was a Maori, a trained social worker and a clinical psychologist working with an elder, basically would build in structured moments of pausing and reflecting on whether the strategies, the goal, what the parent was seeking to do was consistent with their cultural values. And each of them had to reflect for a moment whether that made sense. And it was interesting, as the program progressed, increasingly it just became a thumbs up. You know, not a deep moment of reflection, but it was clear that this was compatible, it was consistent, because the whole program is about promoting self-regulatory capability in children and families. And so that the notion of then testing it in a randomised trial, these are the results on the IBERG Child Behaviour Inventory, pre-post follow-up compared to controls. They were doing significantly better, 9 months follow-up, effects maintained. If you look at the effect sizes relating to the outcomes on these measures, which are typically used in the evaluation of parenting programs. This, by the way, was a 2-session program, 2 hours each. 2 discussion groups, being a positive parent and dealing with disobedience. And it produced a highly significant intervention effect. It's been published now in Prevention Science as an outcome. Now, to me, what that is an example of is respectful engagement with a particular cultural group to determine the relevance and appropriateness of not only the content but the process of delivery, and adapting and adjusting the program to ensure that it still works, or that it works with families they're interested in. So if you think about this as a process, the idea of we have much better capacity to customise and tailor when we have consumer reference groups and end user input right from the beginning, from program design to program scale up. And it may not be the same reference groups that are used for the different tasks. But the point is, we need to design interventions that are fit for purpose and are appropriate to context. And without knowledge of the context, then it's difficult to know what combinations and so on that you need. The way I'd look at it is that every iteration of a program, of a system of intervention like ours, is a local one. And it has to be. And so that local one has to take into account the workforce, type of families that are there, the salient issues that are identified by parents. Now, one way we're doing this in our statewide rollout of Triple P over the last 2.5 years, which has reached 186,000 parents who've participated, is to take in February a POP survey, the pulse of the parenting population. What are the hot button issues in this state right now in February this year, 2018? And so when you think about a survey that was cross-promoted through the Courier Mail and the Channel 7 to promote, cost nothing to do, and just promoted capturing the parent view, what you see is the evolution of changing issues. And so the hot button issues this last time around, apart from screen time and dealing with disobedience, is parents not liking to be judged and parents feeling others passing judgment on them. And so that is something that we in the delivery of programs can take into account. And then not make too many assumptions about what the client population in a given area is currently thinking about what are the important issues that need to be addressed. In that way, you'll have flexible promotion of the program that is best suited to parents' requirements. And so I'll just jump through right to just one last point here. We can't ignore organisational factors that are related to capacities to be delivering programs both with fidelity and flexibility. You need strong line management support, and the delivery of parenting programs has to become core business, not a bolt-on, not on something that's extra that involves you doing something else. We need to select and train the right practitioners who have capacity and an interest and a commitment to deliver programs. Otherwise, it's often wasted money in terms of professional training when there are others who could have been trained who actually want to deliver. We need to make sure that practitioners have adequate supervision and support, particularly in the early stages of the adoption of an evidence-based practice, so that those issues of flexibility and tailoring can be properly dealt with in a supervisory context that's supportive. Establishing implementation targets, not just to do with how many programs are implemented, but how many participants are actually engaged in the program. Because if we want to reach that magic number of about a quarter of the parenting population participating in a parenting program to get a population level shift in the prevalence rates of problems, the number of families is important to keep in mind. And finally, the thing that I think promotes the best fidelity of all is constant tracking of outcomes. Every participating family should have a known outcome. You know the way this was accomplished in the UK for the IAP scheme, which was the increased access to psychological therapies for adults with depression and anxiety? They took a measurement at every session that a participating person was involved in. And so even if they didn't complete a program, they always had a last and most recent assessment of outcome that could then be aggregated across everyone to define an outcome. And they had outcomes definable in over 90% of the participating patient population, which is incredible. You know, if you think about the challenges of getting post-assessments from people, the idea of within every session, take a brief assessment before and after the session, and with customised tools, this is a great way of ensuring that there's no missing data. When we look at the future, and I would just encourage everyone to keep thinking about innovation. We've applied Triple P to very diverse types of problems now. The most recent work that we've been doing has been in the coral reefs in Indonesia, focusing on villages and the promotion of ecologically sustainable family behaviours to do with disposal of plastics. And these are fishing villages that are bomb fishing the reef and using cyanide and killing off the economic futures of their children by ensuring that the reef is dying. And the intervention's called Our Village, Our Ocean, Our Future. And but it's applying Triple P principles of family-based change and mobilising that sense of collective efficacy that we as members of this village community can do something about the economic futures of our kids by looking after the reef and not destroying it. Keep searching for additions to positive parenting techniques, but check them out, test them, trial them, make sure that they actually do add value rather than just clutter up an intervention. We need to understand non-responders, because in understanding non-responders, we need to know when they start to non-respond, because it could be they fail to enter, it could be that they exit early, it could be that they actually implement the programs and the programs actually don't work with the kids. That's a very different thing than not trying them at all and still concluding that they're equivalent in terms of outcome when they're not. And finally, professional training. We have to develop an online training capacity for upskilling the workforce. In-person training is good, but it's expensive and it's hard to do replacement training. The main problem is that we know that there is something about in-person training that allows for coaching, practice feedback, observation feedback that you can't easily replicate on an online process where there's no human involved. And so we have to think of clever ways of simulating those kind of interactional processes to produce change. And so when we think about going forward, what I'd just like to encourage you to think about is that flexibility and fidelity are not opposites, they're complementary. In fact, programs that are delivered with the best fidelity are always responsive to need. And that means being able to tailor and customise to the families you're working with in a way that is highly respectful of their particular context and circumstance. Now, programs that have got this population perspective, a multi-level kind of approach, provide enormous advantages in being able to accomplish that, because it creates a common language, a common way of approaching and thinking about the issues that are important to the well-being of children in the future. So at this point, I'd just like to say, all the best of luck in your efforts to be both flexible and to use evidence-based programs that are known to work if they're deployed effectively. So thank you, everyone. Okay, so let's open it up for a few questions. Yes, sir. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the issue is father engagement. The important. Yeah. Okay, now good point. Okay, so for example, in a state rollout, a state rollout in Queensland, it's free to the end user, to parents, because the government has purchased codes in bulk and they're providing it free as part of the state rollout. Out of a lifetime, $80 compared to what you might be paying to go and see a professional privately is a very inexpensive intervention. No, even for the population, it's a very inexpensive intervention. And all I'm saying is that to the extent you're able to persuade the Western Australian government that having Triple P online, both the younger age group and the older age group, is a sensible and low-cost investment. Because I will say that the trialling of it was, half the trial was conducted here in Perth. So it's not as though that there hasn't been a serious look at this. There are now 7 randomised trials that show that the online 8-session, 8-module version of Triple P works. It works best when there is some professional support alongside it, but it still works for many families, both mothers and fathers who participate in it. But if you're thinking online to increase father participation, forget about it, because it's just as convenient for women to participate in it as on a 24/7 basis. So the other thing about the father engagement, it's interesting with the seminars. I've been running a whole bunch of these in Victoria in the last week, and we had a really healthy roll-up of dads who came out on a wet, cold, windy night and this is in Morwell, and they were right into it. And the thing is that, remember, the best predictor of doing Triple P is knowing a friend, neighbour or relative who's done it. So the social contagion of word of mouth becomes very important for men to be sharing the value of it as well. I mean, I think women naturally do this. They do share what they've learnt in these programs. We know that they talk to others afterwards. Sometimes men won't do this, but they could be encouraged to do so. Okay, any other comments, thoughts, reflections? Yes.
We find across the education department, I think I'm speaking for lots of people, that recruitment is actually extremely difficult. And, even when we feel we've got quite a few people one year and we then promote heavily again and expect people to have been speaking to each other. We go on finding, and I know colleagues in the health department find the same. So I'm just, really...
Yeah, okay, you're raising a very important issue to do with parents' priorities and how they make a call about whether to participate. And the thing is that we've just got to remind ourselves that there are multiple factors at play to do with whether parents will devote their time, invest their time in learning parenting skills. First thing we've got to remember is that they're bombarded by many other requests for their time these days, and any advertising and promotion that we do is just a drop in the ocean when it comes through, things coming back through kids' school bags and so on. So a strong social marketing strategy like the one that's been launched, the Stay Positive campaign, can really, really build momentum in a community. So from going from no participation, I remember we had a seminar similar to the one we've got tomorrow where there was about 450 parents who rocked along. So the thing is that I would also just do two things. Make sure that the social marketing strategy is strong and consistent and continuing. And secondly, that during every seminar, you activate the social contagion amongst the participating parents and really encourage them to talk to other parents. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is to think about delivery context. So we had a great example in Canada, just north of Toronto, where Triple P seminars were offered through schools. They almost got no parents rocking up to do it. They shifted the location from the school to the local cinema and provided a cinema for the kids to watch, and the other cinema, the parents did Triple P. They had a huge crowd. And so childcare is often an issue, and to provide it in a destigmatised context is another way forward. So there's no mystery about parental participation if it's been associated with any stigma, if they see it as something that is either not necessary or it's only for failed parents. I mean, who wants to do a parenting class for failed parents? No one. We have to look at it differently. We've got to look at it from a consumer pull demand perspective. We've got to create an appetite in the parenting population to be hungry for this. And when they're hungry for it, they'll search it out. But how do they get hungry for it? They get hungry for it by realising and understanding the value to their children in them learning these skills. You don't have to really explain to many parents that sending your kid to a good school is good for kids, but you often do have to think about how do you get the message across that the parenting of your children is a hugely influential life determinant of that youngster's success and well-being. And I think we have to take the longer-term view, and we just have to keep chipping away at it and think of many, many different ways to get the message out there. Yes?
Are you going to be moving down the app line? Like I'm involved as a grandparent. I'm sort of now networking with younger new mothers.
Yes.
And my daughter particularly, a lot of the parenting information she's getting will be in an app. And so in our joint care of the grandchild, we all have the same app in our phone, so we can then have conversations based on that, and we can access information when we need it and as the child develops.
Yeah, I think the whole issue of going to different delivery formats and using apps and so on, I mean, is something that I know Triple P International is very seriously considered doing, particularly a kind of a starter app, a taster app, to then provide navigation routes into different kinds of online versions of the program. But one of the things that I'd just like to draw to your attention about why we haven't just gone down the line of dumping all this information on the web so that people can access it through the web. You know, the parents have never had more access to information on parenting than right now on the internet. You do a search on positive parenting, you get millions of hits. A lot of the information is confusing, it's contradictory, you can't tell whether it's evidence-based or not. And you know, even some of our most successful parenting sites like the Raising Children's website and so on, I'd like to see the trial data proving that accessing that parenting information through that site changes parenting. I mean, you can have lots of people going to the site. You can have lots of people saying, gee, it's really helpful information, but does it work? So we've set ourselves quite a strong limiter around Triple P, and that is to only promote web-based solutions that are supported by a proper trial showing it works. Because we know what parents want. They want programs that work. And you say, okay, well, it's convenient, and they grab apps that are available. But in the long run, we have to educate the parenting community of the value of selecting those things that have actually been shown to make a difference to kids' outcomes. So just because you can do it, just because it's convenient and technology enables you to do it, we know probably Google's going to produce a massive way of accessing this information. We've got the economists jumping on board, being appointed to nudging units all around the country and creating these behavioural innovation sort of behavioural insights kind of interventions. They're right into the parenting space at the moment about reading more to your kids and that kind of thing. And what I'm concerned about is that we create an illusion, because it looks good, sounds good, feels good, that it's actually something that is effective, and it's just pushed out there onto the parenting population without due consideration to whether or not it's of any benefit whatsoever. Professionally, we should not support that. We should be looking for the higher and higher professionalisation of the parenting practitioner workforce across all of our disciplines, because we know that if we go down that route, we'll have higher quality program delivery that is more responsive to the needs of children in our communities. That's sort of my take on it all. How are we doing? We almost done? Okay, thanks everyone.
Right, thank you very much, Matt, for that presentation. I've got to say it was fantastic. I think you've absolutely nailed the program fidelity and flexibility question there. For those of you who have been to some of the previous masterclasses we run, you'll actually see a theme coming through that Matt's really sort of taken on a home run, really, in terms of that flexibility and practice there as well. Now, just a couple of things in wrapping up. My sincere apologies for the AV stuff. We did have this all tested out beforehand, and it was actually operating up until the point that Matt actually started his presentation. And I've got to say, well done to Matt for hanging in there, because you really done exceptionally well considering that kept flickering around. Almost felt like we should put up an epilepsy warning there with that presentation. I've seen some of you were trying to take pictures and grab notes and things from it. It has all been recorded on YouTube. So whilst it was flickering away here, the guys at the Perth AV have assured me it's fully recorded. So everything that Matt said, all the slides are all there. So we will make sure that if you're here through the mailing list, which I'm presuming everyone is, we will get that information back out to you, and you can look at Matt at your leisure, read the slides and get the information. So you haven't missed out because of the issues with the AV thing. All right, cool. So tomorrow, so if you couldn't hear that.
I'm also happy to send out the PowerPoint.
Brilliant. All right, we'll get all that out for you as well. Now, I understand Matt's buying everyone drinks at the Avery. Is that right, Matt? Probably not buying you a drink, but if you'd like to catch up with Matt, he's actually heading off to the Avery, which is on the corner here somewhere upstairs, for a few drinks. You have to purchase your own. But feel free to join Matt, the joint management group, Carol and Lisa there, and you can probably get some sneaky questions in if you're quick. So thank you all very much for attending this afternoon. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to grab some muffins and things on the way home, otherwise we'll have to eat them all and I'm on a diet. So thank you all, everyone.